Okay, so today I'm going to talk about this very important area of Russia's history on the end of the 19th century. Was there an agrarian crisis in Russia at the end of the 19th century? So this is a question which has been disputed quite a lot by different historians, and I think it's important that we understand what the basis of this dispute was and how we can come to any conclusions about it. So in this lecture today, I'm going to start by just very briefly telling you, well, what's the context? What was going on in Russia in 1861? So, what's the state of play in Russia? Then I'm going to ask, how can we resolve this dispute? And I'm going to look at the sources that different historians have used in order to try and come to terms with the agrarian crisis, and look at the evidence for and the evidence against before coming to some conclusions. So that's just what I'm going to do today. So, first of all then, rural Russia in 1861. Remember that peasants made up more than 80% of Russia's population, so that the rural situation is always going to be very, very important for Russia. And this is a period from the 1860s up until the early 1900s. This is a period of profound economic, social and cultural transformation. It's a period of change in the countryside, and periods of change are always accompanied by some degree of disruption, and this is certainly the case in Russia. Whether this was a crisis is another matter, but we kind of use as our benchmark the emancipation of the peasants in 1861. This is our starting point. So before 1861, peasants were known as serfs, and that means that they were tied to their landlords, that they were the personal property of an individual. They were tied to a particular portion of land and a particular individual, and this landlord could use and abuse these serfs pretty much as he wished. He could decide who got married, who didn't, where they went, who went into military service, who didn't, and the product of their labour was his, basically. So this is a kind of a very brief overview of what serfdom was. And the serfs were emancipated or freed in 1861 by Alexander II. This is very important because serfdom had been the basis for Russia's economic system, really, as well as a military system, also important. But when the serfs were emancipated, Russia had to change. So the emancipation of the serfs then is of enormous economic significance, because whereas under serfdom, individual peasants had limited control over their own movement, and they had limited ability to be entrepreneurial, for example. With the emancipation of the serfs, new opportunities are opened up, and Russia begins to transform towards a capitalist economy by the end of the 19th century. So there's a period of transformation. And these transformations aren't just economic, they're social and they're cultural and they're political as well. And we're going to try and work out why it is that contemporaries believe there to be a crisis at the end of the 19th century. So when we look at this dispute among historians about was there an agrarian crisis, the starting point is that people at the time, that is, and when I say people, I mean the intelligentsia, the elite, the people who wrote memoirs, who were in positions of political power, these people said that there was a crisis. They were worried about the agrarian situation. And so historians have, from that, started to look into the origins and the development and the existence of an agrarian crisis in at the end of the 19th century in Russia. So I'm going to try today to try and work out how we can resolve this historiographical crisis, because some historians have argued very strongly, yes, there was an agrarian crisis. Things were going very badly wrong. There was terrible poverty, there was terrible economic dearth, agrarian methods weren't improving, there wasn't any improved output. They go on, and there's lots of things that are going wrong, which constitutes a crisis. On the other side, plenty of historians have argued that, in fact, conditions were getting better, that mobilisation was better, that people were working in different trades, that there was more cash economy into the rural areas, that agrarian methods of agriculture were improving. So there's this whole sort of alternative approach. And how do we reconcile these two kind of approaches to this agrarian crisis? I think we need to start by asking how we define a crisis. And I suppose that the question I would ask is, a crisis for who? So if you're the elite, well, what's the crisis for you? It might be a crisis if you perceive there to be poverty, which is bad, which makes you feel guilty, therefore it's critical. It might be a crisis if grain prices are falling, or if you feel that grain production is not increasing rapidly enough. There are different sorts of crisis for different sorts of people. What about for everyday, ordinary peasants? What's their crisis? I mean, I would argue that probably a crisis in an immediate sense for a subsistence peasant farmer would be crop failures, repeated famine. These are things which you would say, okay, we're pointing to a crisis here. And of course, we have the 1891 famine, which is very important in shaping among elites and maybe among ordinary people a sense that there was a crisis. So starvation, there's another thing you'd say, well, that's an indicator of crisis, isn't it? But it's not the only one. I mean, the people who are trying to drive economic growth and development in Russia would say that a lack of economic growth constitutes a crisis. Now, a lack of economic growth constitutes a crisis for people trying to make Russia's economy stronger. It doesn't necessarily constitute a crisis for Russia's ordinary population. Because in fact, a lack of economic growth might well indicate that things are going on much as they did before. So when we have an unchanging situation, then that's not necessarily a crisis, is it? And finally, another sort of area for a potential crisis is, was this an unsustainable economy? Was this a sort of agricultural structure which prevented the growth of the population which was happening in the late 19th century? So there's some of the different aspects. And I think part of the problem of the historiographical debate on was there a crisis comes from differing interpretations of what a crisis was and a crisis for whom. But the other area, which I think is probably more important in terms of how the historiographical dispute has developed, was which sort of sources they used. So when we're looking at rural Russia, we're looking at this vast empire. And if you pick a particular geographical region and do a detailed study of what's going on in that region, then you'll get, hopefully a detailed picture of the state of agriculture, the condition of the peasantry, all these sorts of things. But you'll get it for that region. You won't get a national picture. How do you get a national picture? Well, what historians have done is they've taken statistical material which has been collected from different parts of the empire, they've pulled it together, they've collated it, and they've got average figures. So you can say, looking at the average figure, that the grain production falls in this period, for example. However, this doesn't really tell us very much about the real conditions for the rural population in different parts of the empire, because in one part of the empire, things might have been improving dramatically, whereas in another they might have had a crop failure. And bearing in mind that the Russian Empire is so vast, we could have different climactic conditions in 1 year. That is, in 1 year they might have had a very bad year, they might have had repeated crop failures. In another area, they might have had quite a good year, with good weather conditions, successful crops, good outcomes. So that's one thing. I think that the geographical boundaries have not been clear enough in the way that we've understood the notion of this agrarian crisis. A second problem is the reliability of material. How do we know what we know about the rural population? And this is something which is very, very difficult to come to terms with. So there's another issue for us is how we understand the material. Finally, the range of available sources. It is always difficult to make any kind of conclusive, overarching statements about rural populations, because of this question of difference. There's a lot of differentiation within the Russian Empire, but also because of the difficulty of knowability. So we can know what elites said about peasants. We can know maybe what grain outputs were. We can use various indicators to suggest peasant well-being. So to give an example, to see how many stone houses have been built, to see how many houses have chimneys, to see how many so-called luxury goods peasants are consuming. These could be indicators of peasant prosperity, or on the contrary, of peasant poverty. But how do we measure them? And more than that, how do we actually work out what this meant to ordinary peasants? Because this is where our sources are lacking. We may be able to find out these material indicators, but we can't very often find out what that meant to the ordinary population. So here's where I get to the problem with agrarian crisis, is that it's very difficult to know whether or to what extent there was an agrarian crisis for ordinary people, and to what, well, it's easier for us to know to what extent there was an agrarian crisis for the elites in the way that they perceived the peasant population.